All right, let's take a deep dive into evolution and speciation. We know you're in Mr. Martin's IB biology class, so
You'll definitely want to get a good grasp of this stuff.
yeah, it's going to help you make sense of how life on Earth became so incredibly diverse, right?
Exactly. It's like piecing together a puzzle, figuring out how all these different species came to be. Almost like being a detective.
Okay, so first things first, what is evolution? It's got to be more than just monkeys turning into humans, right?
Oh, way more. Think of it this way. Evolution is about these heritable changes
Changes of what?
in the characteristics of a population, like over a really long time. It's not about like individuals changing,
Hmm.
but about shifts in like the overall gene pool.
So if I suddenly decided to dye my hair purple, that's not evolution, right?
Right. Your kids aren't going to be born with purple hair because of that.
So that's not how it works.
That's closer to this idea called Lamarckism, which we know isn't how it works. Like it suggests that acquired traits could be passed down, but we know that's not the case.
Gotcha. So what is the real deal?
It's Darwin's theory of natural selection.
Survival of the fittest, right?
Yeah, but it's all about the genes. Like certain traits just make organisms better suited to their environment, and so they survive and reproduce more, passing those traits on.
Okay, so it's all about those genes. Got it. But how do we know this is actually true? What's the evidence for this?
Well, there's tons of evidence. For starters, we've got the fossil record.
Like digging up dinosaur bones.
Kinda, but it's more than that. It's basically this timeline of life on Earth, like etched in stone. We see simpler organisms like bacteria and older rocks. And as we move up through the layers, things start to get more complex. We find plants, then fish, then amphibians, and eventually dinosaurs and mammals.
So like a step-by-step guide to the history of life, basically.
Yeah, it paints a pretty clear picture of how life has changed over millions and millions of years.
So we're not going to find a T-Rex fossil hanging out with like trilobites in rocks from a billion years ago.
Nope, not gonna happen. That's the law of fossil succession in action.
Right? Things evolved in a certain order. Okay, so what about those missing links we always hear about? Are those real?
Well, we have something called transitional fossils.
Okay, so like what's an example of a transitional fossil?
Have you ever heard of Archaeopteryx?
Ooh, that sounds like a dinosaur name.
It kind of is. It's a creature that had both dinosaur and bird traits.
So like a dino bird. That's
Mhm.
wild. What kind of traits are we talking about?
Like think feathers and wings, but also teeth and claws. It's a fantastic example of how one group of organisms can evolve into another.
Wow, that's like finding a real-life missing link.
Uh,
But fossils take forever to form, right? Is there any way we can see evolution happening on a faster time scale? Like in our lifetime?
Absolutely. We see it all the time in selective breeding.
Selective breeding.
Or artificial selection, yeah.
Oh, I think I've heard of that. Like breeding dogs.
Exactly. Think about all the crazy dog breeds we have today. From a Chihuahua to a Great Dane, they all came from wolves.
So humans basically sped up evolution by like choosing which traits they wanted to emphasize.
Right.
We basically played the role of natural selection.
Precisely. And it's not just dogs. Think about crops, too, like broccoli, cabbage, kale.
They don't look anything alike.
Well, they're all variations of the same plant, brassica, manipulated through selective breeding.
That's crazy. We've been shaping evolution without even realizing it. So
Okay.
we've got fossils and selective breeding as evidence for evolution. What else is there?
Well, let's look at the anatomy of different species.
Okay.
Have you heard of homologous structures?
Didn't we cover that in class? Something about similar structures with different functions, right?
Right. Like nature is using the same blueprint but tweaking it for different purposes. The classic example is the pentadactyl limb.
The what?
Pentadactyl limb. It's a five-fingered limb found in everything from humans to bats to whales.
Wait, my hand and a whale fin have the same basic bone structure underneath.
Yep. We use our hands for grasping, bats use their wings for flying, horses use their legs for running, and whales use their flippers for swimming. But that underlying structure, incredibly similar.
So even though these limbs have completely different functions, they're all built on the same basic plan.
Exactly. It's a pretty strong indicator that they all came from a common ancestor. And the more similar the structures, the more closely related the organisms are likely to be. This is what we call divergent evolution.
Divergent evolution. So it's like a family tree for limbs. They all branched out from a common ancestor and adapted to different niches.
You got it. So that's homologous structures, similar structures, different functions, pointing to shared ancestry.
Okay, that makes sense. What about analogous structures? How are those different?
Analogous structures are the opposite, same function, different structure. They evolved independently, meaning they don't share a recent common ancestor.
Can you give me an example?
Sure, think about a bird wing and a butterfly wing.
Okay, yeah. Both used for flying, but they look completely different.
Right. Similar environments can lead to similar adaptations, even if the organisms are from totally different lineages. It's called convergent evolution.
So nature finds multiple solutions to the same problem.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. But here's a question. Does evolution always mean new species are popping up?
Ah, that's a great question. Evolution can definitely lead to changes within a species. But for a new species to actually form, you need something called speciation.
Speciation. Okay. What's the key ingredient for that?
Reproductive isolation.
Reproductive isolation. Like what if a group of squirrels gets stranded on a deserted island? Could they eventually become a new species because they're cut off from the mainland squirrels?
Exactly. Over time, they would adapt to their new island environment and accumulate genetic differences. Eventually, even if they met up with the mainland squirrels again, they might not be able to interbreed anymore. And boom, a new species.
But isolation is crucial for speciation. But just being separated isn't enough, right? Those squirrels could be on that island for centuries and still be the same old squirrels.
Right, you need something more. What really drives speciation is this thing called differential selection. Different environments are going to favor different traits. So the isolated populations diverge along different evolutionary paths.
It's like nature is running a series of experiments, testing out which variations work best in each situation. And if those differences become significant enough, you get two distinct species.
You got it. And that's just one way speciation can happen. There are all sorts of fascinating mechanisms involved.
Okay, this is all starting to make sense. I'm starting to see evolution not just as a bunch of facts in a textbook, but as like this dynamic process that's shaped the entire living world.
That's what we're hoping for. It's really exciting stuff, and I bet there are some amazing examples of this out there, like real-life cases of speciation in action.
Oh, I bet. I'm ready to hear about those.
Yeah,
But first, maybe a quick break.
that sounds good.
All right, we're back, and I'm ready for more about speciation. Before the break, we were talking about how, isolation and environmental pressures can split species, right?
Yeah, leading to two different species.
So what other ways does speciation work? What other tricks does evolution have up its sleeve?
Well, there are actually a bunch of different ways speciation can happen, like we were talking about allopatric speciation.
Where they're physically separated.
Exactly, like those squirrels on a deserted island. But you know what? New species can pop up even without a physical barrier.
Wait, really? If they're all living together, wouldn't they just, keep interbreeding? How could they become different species?
It's definitely less common, but it does happen. It's through these pretty amazing mechanisms. One example is sympatric speciation. That's when populations split, but they're still in the same geographic area.
So, they're living in the same place, but somehow evolving in different directions. That seems kind of counterintuitive.
It does, but think about it. Imagine a population of birds.
Okay, birds.
Some of them develop a preference for, say, feeding on a certain type of fruit.
Okay, fruit-loving birds.
And others stick to seeds. Over time, those different eating habits could lead to changes in their beak shape and size, and eventually even their mating preferences.
So they're in the same area, but they're basically living in different ecological niches, which drives them apart.
Exactly. They might be occupying different zip codes, so to speak, and if those differences get strong enough, they could become reproductively isolated, leading to two separate species.
Okay, so we've got allopatric speciation with physical separation and sympatric speciation where they diverge in the same place. Are there any other ways new species pop up?
There are. Another really cool mechanism is polyploidy. That's a sudden change in the number of chromosomes.
Polyploidy, that's a mouthful. What does that even mean?
It's more common in plants, but it can happen in animals too. So imagine a plant accidentally duplicates its whole set of chromosomes during cell division.
Okay, so double the chromosomes.
Exactly, and that can make it instantly incompatible with the original population. Reproductively, I mean.
So boom, instant new species. Just from a chromosome mix-up. That's crazy.
It is. Polyploidy is like this rapid evolutionary jump, creating new species in just one generation. It's one of the reasons the plant world is so incredibly diverse.
That makes sense. So we've got isolation, different environmental pressures, and even these chromosome shenanigans leading to new species. What happens next? Do these new species just keep evolving in their own little bubbles?
Not necessarily. Remember, evolution is all about adaptation and change. Once new species pop up, they can diversify even more through adaptive radiation.
Adaptive radiation. That sounds intense.
It's basically this evolutionary explosion of diversity, all from a common ancestor. Picture this. A group of finches colonizes a new island.
Which is on an island,
So
okay.
the island has all these different habitats, some with forests, some grasslands, some rocky coastlines.
Okay, so picture those finches spreading out.
Yeah. Exactly. Each finding their own little spot, right? And as they adapt to those different environments, they evolve all these different traits, like beak shapes for different foods, different colors for camouflage, new nesting behaviors. The possibilities are endless.
So those finches are like pioneers, venturing out and diversifying into all these new species.
Yeah.
Evolution in fast forward.
Precisely. Adaptive radiation often happens when organisms enter new environments or when like a mass extinction happens and it opens up new opportunities.
Right, so that's how you get these bursts of diversity. It's amazing. But what keeps these new species separate? What prevents them from, like, merging back together?
That's where barriers to hybridization come in. They prevent different species from interbreeding, or even if they do interbreed, from making offspring that survive or are fertile.
So even if those finches from different parts of the island meet up, they're not going to create a bunch of hybrid finches that mess things up.
Exactly. There are these prezygotic barriers. Yeah, they prevent mating or fertilization from happening in the first place.
Yeah.
Think about those birds with different mating songs or rituals. They might not even recognize each other as potential mates.
Like they're speaking different languages.
You got it. And then there are postzygotic barriers. Those come into play if, interbreeding does happen.
What do those do?
Well, they make the offspring inviable or infertile.
Inviable.
Like they don't survive. Or they do survive, but can't reproduce.
So even if they did manage to mate, their offspring wouldn't make a difference in the long run.
Right. A classic example is the mule, the offspring of a horse and a donkey.
Mules, yeah.
Mules are usually sterile, so they can't have their own babies.
So these barriers keep those species lines clear, preventing them from just blending back together.
Yeah. It's like a quality control system for evolution.
It's amazing. Evolution has created this incredible tapestry of life, with each species playing its own unique role.
It really is remarkable, and we're still just scratching the surface. There's so much more to uncover, and scientists are making new discoveries all the time.
I'm definitely feeling inspired to learn more. But before we wrap things up, let's step back and look at the big picture for a minute. Like, what does it all mean? So we've talked about how evolution works, how new species form, even those crazy chromosome changes. But like, what does it all mean? How does knowing about evolution help us understand the world around us?
Well, that's a big question, right? Scientists and philosophers have been trying to figure that out for ages. I think one of the biggest takeaways is that evolution isn't about progress. It's not like there's some ultimate goal, some perfect organism that everything is evolving toward.
So like, humans aren't at the top of some evolutionary ladder.
Nope, not at all. Every species alive today is a success story in its own right. They've all figured out how to survive and reproduce in their own little corner of the world.
There's no one right way to be an organism, is there?
Exactly. What works for a cactus in the desert wouldn't work for a fish in the ocean, right? Diversity is what makes life so amazing.
It's all about finding what works, adapting to the environment. And we see that everywhere.
And that diversity is what makes life so resilient, too. Like, it's this giant experiment with tons of different variations being tested out over millions of years.
I like that, a giant experiment. So what other big insights does evolution offer?
Well, it helps us appreciate how interconnected everything is. Like, we're not just isolated species doing our own thing. We're all part of this big evolutionary story connected through shared ancestry and these complex relationships and ecosystems.
It's not just about individual species then. It's about how they all fit together and how they change together.
Exactly. And that's super important for things like conservation, If we want to protect biodiversity, we have to think about those connections, like how messing with one part of an ecosystem can impact everything else.
That's like a giant Jenga tower. Pull out the wrong block, and the whole thing could collapse.
That's a great analogy. Evolution gives us the tools to understand those complex interactions, to see the bigger picture, so we can make smarter choices about protecting the amazing diversity of life on our planet.
It's mind-blowing. Evolution isn't just something we learn about in biology class. It's a whole new way of looking at the world.
It really is. And it can help us deal with some of the toughest challenges we're facing, like climate change, new diseases,
By understanding how evolution works, we can figure out better ways to live sustainably, predict how organisms might react to these changes, and even come up with new medicines.
Exactly. It's incredibly powerful stuff.
Wow, I never thought about it that way. So understanding evolution isn't just about passing Mr. Martin's class. It's about understanding our own place in the world and what we need to do to protect it.
You got it. And hey, maybe someone listening right now will be the next Darwin, right? The next scientist to make some groundbreaking discovery about evolution.
That would be awesome.
Yeah.
Well, this deep dive has definitely got me thinking. I'm excited to keep learning about this stuff.
That's great to hear. And remember, this is just the beginning. Keep asking questions, stay curious, and never stop exploring. There's a whole world out there.
Thanks for being such an awesome guide on this journey. And to all our listeners, thanks for joining us. We'll catch you next time for another deep dive into the world around us. Keep those brains buzzing.